As the credits roll, please welcome Susanna Fogel. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here and joining us and allowing us to take a deeper look into this.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming, everyone.
A pleasure. I mean, obviously the production is unbelievable and the show is so engaging on so many levels. I want to start from the beginning. Where did this start? How did this come to be?
Okay, so the creators of the show, Joan and Tony, approached me with the idea to tell a story about Meep, whose story I was vaguely familiar with. My mother had lived in Holland after she went to Barnard. Actually, she's from the Bronx originally, so it's nice to be back in New York. But anyway, she had been in Holland, and so we, just growing up Jewish, we knew obviously of Anne Frank's story, but we also heard about Meep. So I knew who she was, hadn't thought about her in decades, and then Joan and Tony approached me with the idea to tell a story from her perspective, having researched it for years and years, and I was really excited to try to do something that felt like it was another lens on a story that we've heard a lot of times in a lot of different iterations, but this felt a little bit, it felt like a fresh and different way to look at, allyship and just being a potential bystander or someone who takes action at a hard time. And then as we were making the show, the world's changed and it became sadly more and more relevant, in the course of the few years that we spent trying to produce the show. And by the time we were shooting, we were, we were employing Ukrainian refugees, and the world really felt like it was starting to repeat some of the themes of the show, which made it all the more resonant to be filming.
And which covers a little bit of my second question, which was really, why is it important to continue to tell this story today from different perspectives? And I find it like, there's a trend of like, let's take that little side character that was in one scene of Star Wars and create a whole new series about them. And obviously, I don't think anybody's taking a cynical approach here with Anne Frank, but here's the story of Anne Frank is actually, I believe, a truly important story. Is there more about why? And I'm also curious, kind of from the Disney side, apart from it being obviously a very famous story and book. Why was it important to tell this story at this point?
I think there's something about stories about historical events that have become so canonized. Like Anne Frank is really one of the most famous figures, literary figures, I guess, to emerge from that time. So I think everybody thinks they know the story, and there's a certain, it's not like a lack of engagement, but there is a certain shorthand people have when they think about Anne Frank, and it's hard to tell that story and add to it in a way that makes people more active audience members in a way, just because everyone reads it at a certain time. They don't necessarily go back and read it again in their adult life. They don't necessarily think about her beyond knowing that she, played this role in the Holocaust. And I think in particular, people like her who become kind of elevated in the culture in that way, they're sort of defined by the role they played in World War II, whether they were a villain of the story or a victim of the story or a hero of the story. They're not necessarily like allowed to be more complex characters because they're so loudly that one thing that they represent. So I think for this, it was wanting to explore a character who people didn't have preconceptions about, and so they had to sort of engage in getting to know her. And we were also allowed to kind of give her flaws and ambivalence and all of the realistic quirks that would go into actually being someone her age who didn't like sign up to do this and didn't know the end of the story and can occupy like a bit more of a flawed, messy space as a character too.
I think it's fabulous. One of the things that I find important in the way Holocaust stories are being represented in cinema or on television today, or in streaming, however we define these things, is to really find that human element that makes it relevant. And I think having it, Anne Frank, her character, if you would try to make Anne Frank today, it would be hard. You know, she's such an icon. That it would be hard to make her I mean, obviously a very relatable character, but she's Anne Frank. You can't say the name without getting a response, and yet having it be, you know, just like the person, the side person who has a story, and deep going into that story and showing their life and the surroundings actually makes it more relatable in many ways.
Yeah, I think so, especially because I think what Meep is able to, Meep's challenge is different. Meep's challenge is like, do I participate in resisting what's going on, or do I, Meep had the option of not doing the hard thing. Like, she could have just kind of waited out the war or left, or not said yes and just said, this isn't my problem, you know? And I think there's, never has there been a time, it just feels like it's more and more relevant to tell stories about people who are faced with that choice and make the choice to act instead of not acting, and not being a bystander. But yet it's not an easy choice to make. Like, when she said yes, she didn't know what it really entailed. She knew that she wanted to say yes and help, but she didn't know that it would be 2 years of having the sort of fate of this family, you know, and their daily happiness was like relying on her bringing them good news and food, and having to risk her own safety and security for so long. So showing along the way that was not always such an easy thing, and some days she was tired. She didn't always wake up feeling super heroic. Sometimes she didn't feel like getting out of bed, and she did anyway. But I think being able to show how difficult it was, and how the different ways that she and Jan chose to participate in the resistance led to some conflict between them and some secrets, and that affected their relationship and in different ways that are interesting, dramatic. Obviously, they were a great couple, but I don't know. Exploring all of those nuances, I think, takes it down from the pedestal of like person who did heroic thing and never had second thoughts about it, and into a world of, yeah, you can do something small that makes a difference, and it doesn't mean that every day it doesn't mean that you go through your life every day feeling like you did the right thing. Sometimes you're like, I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. Am I doing enough? Where do I draw the line? You know, it's just you get to like explore those complexities of that everyday heroism. Although Meep didn't want to be called a hero, she just wanted to be. She's like, I did what anyone would do, and we're like, well, many people didn't, but many people did. And I think her point was just fundamentally we all have it within us to. She had an optimistic view of humanity in the end, you know.
For sure, and I think it's the humanity that we relate to in her character, of the imperfections, the yes and the no, the fears, the doubts, and that makes it also relevant to us, because we all have that as people. I'm curious about the research and the creative freedoms that were took to make this. How much? What kind of research was done? What did you learn that you didn't know? And where were you allowed to just take it in new directions?
Well, Joan and Tony were very thorough in reading everything they could get their hands on. They read everything that Meep and Jan had written. They read family memoirs. They did years and years of research. But then their vision for the show, and one reason I think they approached me when my background was sort of more in stories about young women who are flawed and have wry senses of humor, like going through dramatic things, is kind of what I like to write and direct stories about. So the fact that they came to me to try to infuse a little bit more personality into a character that could otherwise be like a heroic, serious. Anyway, the point is they did the research, but then we talked about ways to not depart from truth, but take things we knew. Like we knew that Meep had that there were people involved in the resistance at this gay bar. The first gay bar in Europe was in Amsterdam, and it became a hub for people to meet and talk about engaging in the resistance. We knew that existed. We also knew that Jan was engaged in the resistance through his job. So we found a way through the characters, through Meep's brother figure, to bring Jan into that world, so we could explore that was sort of a hotbed of the resistance Whether Jan ever entered that bar, we don't know. But so it's a combination of research about Miep and Jan, who not much is known about, and research about the era, and then trying to create dramatic situations that took you into different worlds in that time and place that we knew existed, if not through them. So to use them to sort of tell that story too.
What's brilliant is that the story of Anne Frank, which has been told in so many different ways, is usually told within four walls, and of course taking this perspective allows so many dramatic turns and opens that world up in a dramatic way. Not to say that the story of Anne Frank is not dramatic, but in a very different dramatic way, in terms of really bringing that. And in some ways, it's the person on the outside that experiences the real tension. It's the people on the inside. It's a different way of telling that story, which I really applaud, bringing in that dramatic sense. I wanted to ask one more question before I open it to questions from the audience. There's real historical significance also in terms of film and the story of Anne Frank. It was actually, beyond the Diary of Anne Frank, of course, being one of the first ways that actually stories of the Holocaust were told and taught and continue to be taught. But also, actually, it was brought to the public in art in the first way. The play was actually filmed and was on television. It was the first time one of these stories was actually in mass media. And in some ways, this maybe closes a circle or just loops in a moment in history. What have been kind of the reactions to telling the story this way that you didn't expect?
Let me think about that. Oh, by the way, one thing that I didn't know that I learned is that Margot also kept a diary. It was Anne's diary that was kept, but Margot was also doing her thing, which people didn't know. Yeah.
Published?
Yeah. No, wasn't found, but she was also journaling basically the whole time that Anne was. Okay, wait, I forgot what your question was. What was it?
It's really the significance of telling the Anne Frank story from a new perspective and what the reactions that have surprised you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were certain ways that one thing that was really important to us was, because you're seeing the outside of the annex all the time, you're still seeing like beautiful days in a beautiful city and people wearing their colorful clothing because they're not wearing the clothing that they've been in for weeks, so it was like wanting to, it wasn't an attempt to modernize it, it was just an attempt to sort of take it out of this like sepia history tone, and show the contrasts there. And, like I hired a costume designer who had never done period before, but he had worked on the show Search Party, which is about 20-somethings in Brooklyn, and they have great outfits. And I'm like, great, let's see what you would do, with some research and some knowledge of the period, but let's like put that eye on people trying to express themselves even in that time. There's often like a sort of like a reverence for the look and feel of those shows, and for this, we just wanted to actually represent people in all of their vibrancy and vitality, so that you can really contrast it to what you're to the walls closing in and all of that. But the reaction to that has been good. I think, yeah, for the most part, I think people are just, it feels modern to them because it isn't, we're not playing the stakes of the end the whole way through, which is the way that most stories go. So that's been really positive. And I think that if it had been from Anne's perspective, it would have been a lot harder to tell that story in a way that took any sort of creative or aesthetic chances in that sense without it feeling disrespectful in some way. So I think that we were also inoculated from that because it was about someone over here. But then it kind of, so people seem to appreciate the new perspective, even just that there are characters making jokes and having lives and having love lives and having fights with their friends, and all of that was going on too. To me, that's what makes it feel more real, or just, like this could happen to any of us.
I think it makes it more relevant and alive today. Thank you. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. I see some eager hands up.
Hi. I think the great irony is that when you show the flaws of someone who's done great things, you elevate them even higher because you realize these are real people like us. So congrats on that. Just wondering about, we live in perilous times with, as artists with political correctness, which is often a very good thing, but also it can be worrisome and cultural appropriation. So I'm just curious, were you very proactive? I mean, I saw the disclaimer right at the top, but were there other ways that you had to be proactive in selling the idea and then also marketing it to say, we have honored the history and we know the history, but also this is not history as in a textbook, but we're telling a story in a short period of time, and there needs to be an arc and therefore some give and take.
Yeah, I mean, Joan and Tony's background is they're very experienced and accomplished at like hour-long nighttime soap. Like they worked on Grey's Anatomy for many years, so they're like, okay, they're intellectual, brilliant people who know everything about this time period. Also, they know how to structure a series so that you want to tune in the next week. Like that is a thing that they applied to this, and I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think that getting people to engage in watching something that is in any way historical without turning it off or changing the channel or checking Instagram or whatever is a challenge. So I think, I think it's making something entertaining and making something not feel like homework is like a major priority when you want people to absorb something, especially something that makes you feel complicated feelings, and it's not escapism, and it's not, so I think we're conscious of wanting to be respectful of the period and of the stories, but also trying to reel people in to sort of the life of this young, vibrant person, and then you kind of actually learn a lot about history along the way, but leading equally with the entertainment value, I think it's like a noble thing. I think in the end, I think it's okay to sacrifice moments of self-seriousness in the service of getting people to just engage in it and not be like, oh yeah, I know that story. But it's always a challenge. You don't want people to think you're kind of exercising too much creative freedom or that you're trivializing any of it. But yeah, I think the fact that the story is really about a person who was adjacent to the Franks helps a little bit, just because it's really the story of an ally and not Anne herself. So hopefully that could be any of us. But yeah, I mean, yes, it was challenging.
First of all, I want to say it was really good. Really, really good. So moving. Wow.
There are 7 more episodes you can binge
I'll watch
tonight.
them, actually. I think that for me, as I sat and watched, I was thinking about why I never spent more time thinking about the people that actually helped the Frank family. That was one thing I was thinking. And I think another thing that I really am curious about, because I think I'm thinking about what makes someone actually do something so brave. And I think a lot of us think of that, like, what motivates someone? What's the difference between someone who keeps walking down the street, just is afraid or whatever, and someone who actually takes action? And so my question is, did that conversation actually happen? I mean, the conversation between Otto and Miep, the moment that we see a connection, that she's connecting to this guy because they're both outsiders and she's had a really hard life. Do you think that actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, they became they really became quite close. Like by the time he asked her, she was very embedded in his family life, and they were, in the pilot we show them meeting, and then we kind of jump to the place where he's like not family to her, but that they have a really nice colleague relationship. Yeah, I mean, he did ask her. They became family, obviously, through the ordeal, and then afterwards, when he came back from the camps, he lived with he lived with Meep and Jan for 7 years and helped raise their kid, and it was a really deep sort of father-daughter thing. But yeah, that conversation did happen. Obviously the details are less clear because Meep's memoir, she went into it, but she didn't sort of. It wasn't a diary with the exhaustive detail that it wasn't as confessional and chatty and emotional as like Anne's diary. But Meep was keeping a journal too. So yeah, the conversation happened one way or another. We just tried to make it feel like it had the right dynamics.
Is there going to be another series after this? It seemed to, from what I saw, imply that there would be, although it was hard for me to see how that would happen. And my other question is, could you just talk a little bit about working with Liev Schreiber, who I thought was just outstanding?
Sure. The hope is that the stories of people like Meep, that there are so many stories. They're sort of shining the spotlight on somebody that sort of was in the shadows quietly doing something selfless, and that there's so many stories in history that would make for wonderful shows and an anthology sort of thing. So, there's a fruitful reserve of stories from history that we could like draw on. So I'm not sure what the plans are. I think it would be great. Liev was amazing. He's not the first person you think of when you think of Otto Frank, because our experience of knowing Otto in culture is more that we just know him as Anne's father. We don't really know the other dimensions of him. We know him as a sweet, like kind, but ultimately like traumatized person who's devoted his life to putting Anne's story out there. And this was an opportunity to show him as a husband, as a boss, as a businessman, as someone reckoning with his own, figuring out how he wanted to define himself, because he wasn't a very religious person. He considered himself German first and Jewish also, but he was primarily considered himself born and raised in Germany. So when he no longer was allowed to call himself German, that really caused a lot of, I just think there's like a diaspora story that he was going through too. So anyway, exploring all of that was just a new take on this sweet dad that we've seen Otto be. So we wanted somebody who could kind of bring a really unexpected energy to it. And Liev has such a presence. He's such a kind of, he just has a lot of like, there's a lot of gravitas there, and he has kind of a quiet masculinity to him that we aren't used to. So anyway, he brought an unexpected layer to this character and helped us really define him anew from what we might have thought. And he was really game for that. It wasn't a role that I think it took him a minute to dig in. He did a lot of research too, just to dig into the other parts of Otto's identity and like identity crisis that we never would have known if it was just through Anne's story. So he was, he's like a very thorough RADA trained theater actor. So he was really research oriented and really devoted himself to the part. So it was a great experience working with him too.
We're going to take one last question up there.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. It really was very engrossing film. For me, she came across as a high-strung filly. very strong, and very courageous. Those were her primary characteristics for me. So I just wondered how true to research, it's easy, maybe it's easier to portray a character that's not multi-dimensional. I'm just thinking out loud. In your research, how close did you come to her, do you think, honestly?
She wrote a memoir, and she wrote her accounts of her story and her background, and she talked about going out with her friends, going to the clubs, meeting men. She talked about meeting Jan. She was kind of an alpha female in her way, and she also talks about really relatable everyday, completely timeless fights that she would get into with Jan about the fact that she really does go into the banal details of her life in a way that it tracks. She has this like vivacious spirit. She didn't care about having kids. She didn't care about getting married, which which was really progressive for that time to have that different vision for yourself as a woman. So there wasn't a lot of, I mean, obviously there's invention in figuring out how she would engage with these characters, or we gave her a best friend because she talked about friends and we were like, okay, we're going to make one friend that presents challenges to her, whatever. But yeah, I mean, what she says about how she was and how it's sort of a coming of age story, what she went through that was catalyzed by this job and ultimately this decision. She talks about the before all of that happened and how she sort of was an irresponsible party girl, more or less, who became reformed and really sophisticated through the process of having to take on this enormous responsibility. But yeah, I mean, she talked about what you saw. Yeah, that phase of her life. I think she was probably a bit quieter and a little bit, I know she was unassuming. She was really modest. She didn't like the spotlight. And she probably was a little shyer than we showed her being. But because she shared her innermost thoughts with this journal, we kind of externalized them. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for being here with us. Folks, thank you for coming out and being a part of this and watching this together. You could watch it. It's on Hulu and Disney Plus and possibly other places, or
Nat Geo and every ABC owned
and
place.
ABC, right? All the ABC family stuff. Please join us for more this summer, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.